The gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot through the mahogany-paneled courtroom. Judge Harlan Voss, a man notorious for his ruthless courtroom games, thought he was dealing with just another delinquent. He looked down from his bench at 16-year-old Malik Donovan, offering to play a little game of truth or lie to decide the boy's fate. It was supposed to be an easy, entertaining humiliation, but Voss made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't know the quiet teenager standing before him possessed a genius-level IQ and a photographic memory of the entire state penal code. By the time this session ended, a career would be destroyed, the gavel would change hands, and courtroom history would be made. The air inside Courtroom. 302 of the Fulton County Courthouse was stagnant, smelling of old paper, floor wax, and decades of nervous sweat. Rain lashed against the tall, reinforced glass windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the gallery. At the front of the room, sitting high upon his elevated bench, was Judge Harlan Voss. Voss was a man who viewed the justice system not as an instrument of fairness, but as his personal kingdom. He had a reputation for being unyielding, heavily biased, and dangerously bored. To entertain himself, especially during juvenile or petty hearings, he had developed a highly unorthodox and legally dubious tactic he called truth or lie. He used it primarily on defendants who couldn't afford top-tier representation, tricking them into waiving their rights or confessing on the record under the guise of an informal chat. Standing at the defense table, looking entirely out of place in an oversized, faded suit, was 16-year-old Malik Donovan. Malik was facing charges of grand larceny and unauthorized access to a secure network. The prosecution, led by a smug assistant district attorney named Quentin Hale, alleged that Malik had stolen high-end proprietary hardware from a local tech firm, NexusTech, and hacked their mainframe. The reality, however, was entirely different. Malik had salvaged discarded, broken parts from a dumpster in a public alleyway, parts the company had legally abandoned. He had then rebuilt them into a functioning supercomputer in his bedroom to study advanced constitutional law and case precedents. But to Judge Voss, Malik was just another statistic, another face to be processed, humiliated, and locked away. "Well, Mr. Donovan," Judge Voss drawled, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses and looking down his nose, "it appears your court-appointed attorney has been delayed, or perhaps he simply realized the futility of defending a kid caught red-handed with corporate property." Malik didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his posture straight, his dark eyes locked onto the judge. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice remarkably steady and resonant for a teenager. "Under the Sixth Amendment, I have the right to counsel. However, given the circumstances and the prosecution's lack of substantive evidence, I am prepared to proceed pro se for today's preliminary hearing." A ripple of muted laughter drifted from the prosecutor's table. Hale leaned back in his leather chair, smirking. Judge Voss's eyebrows shot up. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "Is that so? A 16-year-old Perry Mason? How quaint. You want to represent yourself against the district attorney's office. You realize the maximum penalty for these felonies is a decade in a juvenile detention facility, followed by adult probation." "I am aware of the statutory maximums, Your Honor," Malik replied, his face a mask of absolute calm. "I am also aware of Ferretta v. California, which guarantees my constitutional right to represent myself, provided my waiver of counsel is knowing and intelligent." Voss's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. The kid knew his case law, but Voss's arrogance quickly overrode his surprise. He saw this not as a warning sign, but as an opportunity for better entertainment. "All right, Mr. Donovan, since you're so confident," Voss said, a predatory glint in his eye. "Let's save the taxpayers some time and money. I propose a shortcut, a little game I like to call truth or lie." Bailiff Kane, standing by the door, shifted uncomfortably. He had seen the judge pull this stunt before. It was a manipulative psychological trap. "The rules are simple," Voss continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I will ask you a series of questions. You will answer with truth or lie, followed by a brief explanation. If I find your answers satisfactory and truthful, I might just dismiss these charges right now. But if I catch you in a lie, or if you refuse to play, I will hold you in contempt, deny bail, and remand you to county lockup until your trial." Prosecutor Hale practically beamed. It was an illegal ultimatum, a blatant violation of Malik's Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But Hale wasn't about to object. Voss was doing his job for him. Malik's mind worked at a staggering speed. His IQ, tested secretly by a high school counselor, hovered comfortably above 160. He possessed an eidetic memory. In the time since his arrest, he had consumed the entire state penal code, procedural rules, and decades of appellate rulings. He saw exactly what Voss was doing. He saw the trap. But Malik also saw the exit. He saw a way to turn the judge's arrogant game into a legally binding weapon. "I understand the rules, Your Honor," Malik said quietly. "Excellent," Voss smiled, leaning back. "Let's begin. Question 1. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Malik interrupted, his voice cutting through the heavy air of the courtroom. "Before we begin your game, I have one condition." Voss frowned, his ego bristling at the interruption. "You don't get to make conditions, boy. If we are substituting standard preliminary procedures with a verbal inquiry, I want it entered into the official court record that this exchange is a binding evidentiary hearing," Malik stated clearly, pointing toward the court reporter, a quiet woman named Mrs. Whitaker, whose fingers were hovering over her stenotype machine. "Every word of truth or lie must be transcribed. Furthermore, I request that the prosecution stipulate to the admissibility of this transcript in any future proceedings, including disciplinary reviews." Hale scoffed loudly. "The state doesn't stipulate to games, kid." "Then the state must object to the judge's methods right now," Malik countered smoothly, turning his gaze to the prosecutor. "Unless, of course, Mr. Hale is comfortable with reversible error and a glaring violation of judicial conduct." The courtroom went dead silent. The rain battered the windows. Voss glared at the teenager, his face flushing a deep crimson. The kid wasn't just smart. He was dangerously precise. "Record it, Mrs. Whitaker," Voss snapped, his pride blinding his legal judgment. "Let the record show the defendant agreed to this inquiry. Let's see how smart you really are, Mr. Donovan. Truth or lie, you knowingly bypassed the encrypted firewall of NexusTech on the night in question." Malik looked directly into the judge's eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in the faintest ghost of a smile. The game had begun, and the judge had no idea he was playing against a grandmaster. "Truth," Malik answered, his voice echoing in the silent room. "But the real question, Your Honor, is whether you're prepared for the truth about why." Voss leaned over the heavy oak bench, his mocking smile freezing in place. "The truth about why," Voss repeated, his voice dropping an octave. He let out a dry, condescending chuckle. "Oh, this should be good. Truth or lie, Mr. Donovan, you hacked into NexusTech's mainframe to steal their proprietary source code and sell it on the dark web. That is the standard motive for cyber theft, is it not?" "Lie," Malik answered, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. He didn't break eye contact with the judge. "I bypassed their firewall because the discarded hardware I legally salvaged from their dumpster, specifically a damaged server drive with the serial number 884 Bravo Tango, contained unencrypted financial data, social security numbers, bank routing details, and medical records of over 40,000 local citizens." The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute. Even Mrs. Whitaker, the court reporter, paused for a fraction of a second before her fingers resumed flying across her stenotype machine. At the prosecution table, Quentin Hale shot up from his chair, his face entirely drained of its previous smugness. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is making wild, defamatory accusations against a respected local corporation. This is a preliminary hearing, not a forum for slander. Malik turned slightly, fixing his sharp, intelligent gaze on the panicked prosecutor. You didn't object to the format of this proceeding, Mr. Hale. Judge Voss proposed a game of truth or lie, and I am simply providing the truth. Furthermore, truth is an absolute defense to slander. Are you attempting to strike my testimony from the record after explicitly agreeing to this informal evidentiary inquiry? Hale opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked up at Voss, silently begging the judge to shut this down. But Voss's ego was far too massive to back down now. He viewed Malik's technical jargon as a bluff, a desperate smokescreen thrown up by a cornered street kid. Overruled, Voss snapped, slamming his gavel down once. He glared at Hale. Sit down, counselor. Let the boy dig his own grave. He turned his predatory stare back to Malik. So, you expect this court to believe you are some kind of digital Robin Hood? Truth or lie, you possessed stolen corporate property in your bedroom at the time of your arrest. Lie, Malik said smoothly. Voss's face flushed. Officer Keller's arrest report clearly states he found NexusTech hardware in your residence. Officer Keller found reconstructed hardware that I built, Malik corrected, his tone clinical and precise. I acquired the base components from a municipal waste receptacle located in the public alleyway behind NexusTech's loading dock. Under the United States Supreme Court precedent established in California versus Greenwood, there is no reasonable expectation of privacy for discarded materials placed in a public area for collection. The moment NexusTech threw those components into a public dumpster, they legally abandoned them. One cannot steal abandoned property, Your Honor. Therefore, the charge of grand larceny is fundamentally flawed as a matter of law. Voss blinked. The legal citation hit him like a physical blow. He shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed leather chair. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kids from Malik's neighborhood were supposed to stutter, cry, or take a plea deal out of sheer terror. They were not supposed to cite Fourth Amendment Supreme Court rulings from memory. A cute legal theory, Voss sneered, trying to regain his footing. But it doesn't excuse unauthorized access to a secure network. You admitted to bypassing their firewall. I did, Malik nodded. Which brings us to your next question, Your Honor. Ask me how I bypassed it. Voss hated being directed in his own courtroom, but his morbid curiosity, coupled with his blinding arrogance, pushed him forward. Fine. Truth or lie, you used malicious software to force your way into their secure server. Lie, Malik said, leaning forward slightly, resting his hands on the defense table. I didn't need malicious software. I used the administrative login credentials that NexusTech negligently left saved in plain text on the abandoned hard drive. I logged in to send an automated encrypted email to the system administrator, Marcus Langford, notifying him of the catastrophic data leak they were actively ignoring. At the mention of the name Marcus Langford, Prosecutor Hale visibly flinched. He aggressively shuffled his files, refusing to look at the judge. Malik noticed the micro-expression immediately. His photographic memory recalled the case files, the arrest reports, and the glaring omissions in the prosecution's discovery packets. The pieces of the puzzle were locking into place perfectly. Truth or lie, Your Honor? Malik suddenly asked, turning the game back on the judge. You do not ask the questions here, Voss roared, his patience finally snapping. I have a right to address the prosecution's evidence, Malik countered, his voice rising just enough to command the room without shouting. I sent an email to Marcus Langford, but that email is completely missing from the prosecution's discovery file provided to me. In fact, the hard drive I salvaged, the one proving the data breach, was conveniently left off Officer Keller's evidence log. Malik took a step toward the center of the room, pointing directly at Hale. Truth or lie, Mr. Hale? You deliberately ordered Officer Keller to omit the hard drive from the evidence locker because Marcus Langford is a major donor to your boss's re-election campaign and exposing a massive data breach would destroy NexusTech's upcoming IPO. The courtroom erupted. "Objection! Outrageous! Your Honor, shut him up!" Hale bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Order!" Voss slammed his gavel repeatedly, the loud cracks echoing over the sound of the rain. "Mr. Donovan, you are dangerously close to a contempt charge. You will cease these baseless accusations immediately." "They aren't baseless if they are true, Judge Voss," Malik said, his voice piercing through the chaos. "And since you insisted on making this game part of the official binding record, I am formally accusing the District Attorney's Office of a Brady violation, withholding exculpatory evidence, and I have the digital footprint to prove it." Voss stared at the teenager. The trap hadn't just sprung. It had snapped its steel jaws right around the neck of the prosecution, and Voss, by forcing this game onto the court record, had just made himself an unwitting accomplice to exposing a massive corporate and political cover-up. Malik offered a cold, calculated smile. "Your turn, Judge. Truth or lie?" The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 remained shut, but inside the atmosphere had shattered into a million jagged pieces. District Attorney Quentin Hale was no longer smirking. His face was a pale, sickly mask of panic. He practically clawed at the prosecution table, knocking over a stack of manila folders that scattered across the polished floor. "Your Honor, this is a circus!" Hale shouted, his voice cracking under the sudden immense pressure. "The defendant is a minor making fabricated defamatory claims. I move for an immediate recess and request that this entire exchange be stricken from the official record." Judge Harlan Voss gripped his gavel, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to grant the motion, to bury this disaster before it incinerated his courtroom. But before he could utter a single syllable, Malik's calm, authoritative voice cut through the rising panic. "Objection, Your Honor," Malik stated, not moving an inch. "You cannot strike this from the record. Pursuant to the rules of this court, once a party, in this case, the state represented by Mr. Hale, stipulates to an evidentiary inquiry, they cannot retroactively withdraw that stipulation simply because the evidence revealed is highly incriminating to their own office." Malik turned to look at the court reporter, Mrs. Whitaker, whose hands were still resting on her machine. "And since Mrs. Whitaker has sworn an oath to accurately record these proceedings, altering or deleting this transcript to hide a Brady violation would constitute tampering with public records, a felony, Your Honor. I am certain neither you nor Mrs. Whitaker wishes to risk a federal indictment for a corrupt prosecutor." Mrs. Whitaker swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Judge Voss. She deliberately kept her hands on the keys, refusing to look away. She wasn't going to go to prison for Quentin Hale. Voss felt a cold drop of sweat trace its way down his spine. The trap was flawless. By forcing this arrogant truth or lie game onto the record to humiliate a teenager, Voss had cemented his own involvement. If he struck the record now, Malik could file a complaint with the State Judicial Review Board, and the missing transcript would be proof of a cover-up. If he kept it on the record, he was actively facilitating the destruction of NexusTech's multi-million-dollar IPO and exposing a corrupt DA's office, people who funded his own judicial campaigns. He was paralyzed. "You have no proof of these wild allegations, boy," Voss finally hissed, dropping his voice to a menacing whisper. "You are bluffing. Officer Keller logged every piece of equipment taken from your residence." "Truth or lie, Judge?" Malik asked, leaning casually against the defense table. "Did Officer Keller log a 2-terabyte solid-state drive with the manufacturer serial number 99 Delta X-Ray 7? Because that is the drive containing the 40,000 unencrypted files. It was resting on my desk, right next to the motherboard." Hale lunged forward. "There was no such drive." "Then you wouldn't mind if I recite the exact SHA 256 cryptographic hash values of the primary database file, would you?" Malik fired back instantly, his dark eyes locked onto Hale, unblinking. E3B0C442988FC1C149AFBF4C8996FB924. Shall I continue, Mr. Hale? I have the entire alphanumeric sequence memorized. I also memorized the internal directory structure, the plain text passwords Marcus Langford used, which ironically was just admin 2024, and the bank routing numbers for NexusTech's offshore shell accounts. Hale looked as if all the oxygen had been sucked from his lungs. He collapsed back into his leather chair, a defeated, terrified man. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. A disheveled man in a rumpled gray suit rushed in carrying a battered leather briefcase. He was panting, completely soaked from the rain outside. It was Everett Lang, the overworked public defender assigned to Malik's case. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay," Lang gasped, rushing down the center aisle. "Traffic was completely deadlocked. I am here to represent Mr. Donovan. I move for a standard continuance so I can review the prosecution's discovery." Voss let out a massive sigh of relief. This was his out. "Ah, Mr. Lang, you are a sight for sore eyes. Motion granted. This preliminary hearing is adjourned until—" "I object," Malik said loudly, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Lang froze, looking at his teenage client in shock. "Malik, what are you doing? Be quiet. I'm trying to save you." "With all due respect, Mr. Lang, you are late, and you are interrupting my defense," Malik said firmly. He turned his attention back to the bench. "Your Honor, as I stated before we began your game, I am proceeding pro se. I have not retained Mr. Lang, nor do I accept his counsel. Under Ferretta v. California, you cannot force an attorney upon me." "Mr. Donovan, you are a 16-year-old child," Voss roared, slamming his hand flat on the desk. "You are in over your head, and I am putting a stop to this charade right now. Mr. Lang is your attorney of record." "Only if I consent, which I do not," Malik replied, his voice chillingly calm. "If you force Mr. Lang to represent me, it is a structural error that will trigger an automatic reversal on appeal. Furthermore, adjourning this hearing now, while an active accusation of prosecutorial misconduct is on the record, would be a blatant abuse of judicial discretion." Malik took a step toward the center of the room, pointing directly at the witness stand. "We are in the middle of an evidentiary hearing, Your Honor. I have answered your truth or lie questions. Now it is my turn to call a witness. I demand that Officer Vance Keller be brought to that stand immediately under oath to explain exactly who ordered him to remove the solid-state drive from the evidence locker." Lang dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a loud thud. He stared at Malik, then looked at the pale, sweating prosecutor, and finally up at the furious, cornered judge. The seasoned public defender instantly realized he hadn't walked into a preliminary hearing. He had walked into an execution, and the teenager wasn't the one on the chopping block. Voss glared down at Malik, his mind racing. "Bailiff Kane," the judge finally choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "Yes, Your Honor," the bailiff asked, stepping forward, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. "Find Officer Keller. He should be in the precinct across the street," Voss ordered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Bring him to courtroom 302 immediately." Malik offered a small, polite nod. "Thank you, Your Honor. The truth is finally making an appearance." Agonizing minutes passed in courtroom 302. The oppressive silence was broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass and the nervous, rhythmic tapping of District Attorney Quentin Hale's pen against his mahogany table. Public Defender Everett Lang stood rigidly near the back of the room, entirely forgotten, watching a 16-year-old boy orchestrate a legal masterpiece. Finally, the heavy oak doors swung open. Officer Vance Keller strode down the center aisle. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck and a demeanor that suggested he was entirely unfazed by the formalities of a courtroom. His uniform was damp from the rain, and he looked annoyed at having been pulled away from his precinct across the street. He assumed this was just a routine wrap-up for a juvenile delinquent who had gotten caught playing with stolen tech. He didn't notice the sickly pallor of the prosecutor. He didn't notice the beads of sweat on Judge Harlan Voss's forehead. "Step up to the witness stand, Officer Keller," Judge Voss ordered, his voice lacking its usual thunderous authority. Keller took the stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He settled into the chair, adjusting his duty belt, and shot a condescending smirk at Malik. "Mr. Donovan," Voss said, gesturing weakly with his hand, "proceed, and I remind you, you are bound by the rules of evidence." "Thank you, Your Honor," Malik replied smoothly. He stepped out from behind the defense table, his oversized suit jacket billowing slightly. He held a single thin folder. He walked toward the witness stand with the measured, unhurried pace of a seasoned litigator. "Officer Keller," Malik began, his voice clear and resonant, "on the evening in question, you executed a search warrant at my residence at 442 West Side Avenue. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Keller grunted, leaning back. "Found a whole pile of stolen NexusTech equipment in your bedroom. Wires, motherboards, the works. Caught you red-handed. And as the arresting and searching officer, it was your duty to log every piece of evidentiary material removed from my property into the Fulton County evidence locker. Correct?" "Standard operating procedure," Keller replied, looking bored. "I logged it all, every last stolen chip." Malik opened his thin folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Let the record reflect I am handing the witness defense exhibit A, a copy of the official police evidence log provided to me in the prosecution's discovery packet." Malik handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Keller. "Officer Keller, do you recognize this document?" Keller glanced at it for less than a second. "Yeah, that's my log. My signature is at the bottom." "And you testify under penalty of perjury that this log represents a complete and accurate inventory of everything you seized from my bedroom?" Malik asked, his dark eyes locking on to the officer. Keller scoffed. "Yes, I didn't miss a single screw, kid." Malik turned his back on the witness, slowly walking toward the prosecution table, where Hale was gripping the edges of his desk so hard his knuckles were snow-white. "That is fascinating," Malik said to the courtroom, "because earlier in this very hearing, the state stipulated to a truth or lie inquiry. So let us play truth or lie, Officer Keller. When you entered my bedroom at the time of the search, there was a silver 2-terabyte solid-state drive resting on the center of my desk, completely separate from the reconstructed server tower." Keller's bored expression vanished. A flicker of genuine confusion, followed rapidly by defensive anger, crossed his face. He glanced over at Hale, expecting an objection. But Hale was paralyzed, staring blankly ahead. "I don't know what you're talking about," Keller said, his voice tightening. "Everything I found is on that list." "Lie," Malik said, spinning around to face the stand. The sudden sharpness in his voice made the court reporter jump. "You saw the drive, you picked it up, but you didn't log it. Why?" "Objection! Badgering the witness!" Hale suddenly screamed, finding his voice in a desperate panic. "The officer already answered the question." "Overruled," Voss snapped, surprising even himself. The judge realized that if he protected Keller now, he would be firmly cementing his own role in a criminal conspiracy. "The witness will answer the question." "There was no drive," Keller insisted, his face flushing red. "The kid is making things up to save his own skin." Malik didn't flinch. He walked back to his folder and pulled out a second sheet of paper. "Officer Keller, are you familiar with the department's policy regarding the Axon body-worn cameras?" Keller swallowed hard. "Yes. They are to remain activated during the entirety of a search warrant execution." "Indeed," Malik nodded. "In the discovery packet provided to me by Mr. Hale, there are exactly 42 minutes of body cam footage from your camera. However, the metadata, the digital timestamp embedded in the video file's source code, indicates a glaring discrepancy." Malik held up the paper, pointing to a highlighted line of text. According to the metadata, your camera was manually powered off and powered back on 3 minutes later. The exact 3 minutes you were alone in my bedroom while your partner, Officer Jenkins, was securing the perimeter outside. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Cameras malfunction," Keller stammered, his confident posture entirely collapsing. "Battery issues. It happens all the time." "Truth or lie, Officer Keller," Malik pressed, stepping closer to the stand, his presence suddenly towering and authoritative despite his youth. "Did the camera malfunction? Or did you turn it off so you could answer a phone call from District Attorney Quentin Hale?" "Objection! Speculation! This is a complete fabrication!" Hale roared, practically launching himself over his table. "It is not speculation if I have the corresponding dispatch logs, Your Honor," Malik shot back, his voice slicing through the prosecutor's panic. Malik turned to Judge Voss. "Your Honor, I used my legally allotted phone call from juvenile lockup to instruct a trusted associate to file a Freedom of Information Act request for the police dispatch communication logs from that night. While Officer Keller's camera was malfunctioning, his radio mic was still transmitting a low-frequency open carrier signal to dispatch." Malik pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the judge's bench. "I have the audio file right here. Would you like me to play it for the court? Because in that audio, you can clearly hear a phone ringing in the background, followed by Officer Keller saying, and I quote, 'Yeah, Mr. Hale, I found the silver drive. NexusTech's data breach is on it. Understood. It doesn't go on the log. I'll drop it off at your house tonight.'" The blood drained completely from Officer Keller's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Quentin Hale dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the floor. He slowly sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was destroyed. Judge Harlan Voss stared at the small silver USB drive resting on his polished mahogany desk, as if it were a venomous snake. The game of truth or lie had just unearthed a massive felony conspiracy involving the district attorney's office, a corrupt police officer, and a multi-million-dollar tech corporation. And it was all officially on his court record, transcribed perfectly by Mrs. Whitaker. Malik Donovan stood tall in the center of the room, looking at the judge who had tried to humiliate him just moments ago. "So, Judge Voss?" Malik asked, his voice calm, polite, and absolutely devastating. "I believe it is your turn again. Truth or lie, are you going to dismiss these fraudulent charges against me, or are we going to need to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation to this courtroom to secure the evidence?" The silence in courtroom 302 was no longer just tense. It was suffocating. The small silver USB drive resting on Judge Harlan Voss's mahogany bench looked heavier than a brick of solid lead. The game of truth or lie had officially ended, and the house always wins. Except this time, the house was a 16-year-old boy in a hand-me-down suit. Judge Voss slowly raised his eyes from the drive, looking past the paralyzed prosecutor and the sweating, terrified police officer, until his gaze met Malik Donovan. The teenager stood with perfect posture, completely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the destruction he had just unleashed. Voss was a corrupt man, but he wasn't a stupid one. His survival instincts, honed over decades of political back-scratching in Fulton County, violently kicked in. If he tried to bury this now, Malik's trusted associate would simply leak the audio to the press, the state ethics board, and the federal government. Voss's career, his pension, and his freedom would vanish overnight. There was only one play left: throw District Attorney Quentin Hale to the wolves and play the role of the outraged, impartial jurist. "Bailiff Kane," Voss's voice cracked slightly before he cleared his throat, forcing a harsh, booming tone. "Secure the courtroom. Lock the doors. No one leaves." The bailiff, wide-eyed, immediately unclipped his radio and stepped in front of the heavy oak double doors. Quentin Hale snapped out of his catatonic state. He scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching violently against the floorboards. "Harlan, Your Honor, listen to me. This is a manufactured deepfake. The kid is a hacker. He fabricated that audio file to frame us." "Sit down, Quentin," Voss roared, slamming his gavel so hard the handle nearly splintered. "Do not speak another word in my courtroom unless it is to beg for a federal plea deal." Voss turned his wrath toward the witness stand. Officer Vance Keller was gripping the wooden rail so tightly his knuckles were white. "Officer Keller," Voss sneered, his voice dripping with sudden, venomous self-righteousness. "You are hereby remanded into the custody of the court under suspicion of perjury, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Hand your service weapon and badge to the bailiff immediately." "Judge, you can't do this," Keller pleaded, his tough guy facade completely shattering. He pointed a trembling finger at Hale. "He made me do it. Hale said it was a matter of state security. He said NexusTech's IPO would crash the local economy if the data breach got out." "And there it is," Malik said quietly. His voice didn't need to be loud to command the room. "The motive on the official record. Thank you, Officer Keller." Everett Lang, the public defender who had arrived late to the bloodbath, slowly slid into a chair at the defense table. He looked at Malik with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. "Kid," Lang whispered out of the corner of his mouth, "what exactly did you do?" "I applied the law, Mr. Lang," Malik replied calmly, not taking his eyes off the bench. "Your Honor," Malik continued, stepping forward, "as Officer Keller just confessed on the record, this was never about a stolen motherboard or a teenage hacker. This was a coordinated effort by the district attorney's office to suppress a catastrophic data leak at NexusTech. Marcus Langford, the CEO, intentionally ignored the breach because fixing it would require delaying their public stock offering and tanking their valuation. They used my salvage of their discarded hardware as a scapegoat." Hale buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob. The karma was instant and absolute. The man who had spent his career bullying the defenseless was now utterly broken by one. "Furthermore," Malik stated, reaching into his inside jacket pocket. The bailiff flinched, but Malik merely withdrew a folded piece of heavy stock paper. "Before I was arrested, I anticipated that the local authorities might be compromised given NexusTech's heavy political donations in Fulton County, so I took precautionary measures." Voss narrowed his eyes. "What measures, Mr. Donovan?" "I wrote a script," Malik explained, his tone conversational as if he were discussing a high school science project. "A dead man's switch. If I did not log into my secure server at regular intervals, an automated packet of encrypted data was scheduled to be sent to external authorities." Malik walked up to the bench and handed the paper to the judge. "That is a delivery confirmation receipt, Your Honor. Earlier that morning, shortly before this hearing began, the complete contents of that missing solid-state drive, along with the dispatch audio and Marcus Langford's internal emails detailing the cover-up, were delivered to the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Atlanta and the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission." Voss read the paper. The official federal routing numbers and cryptographic receipts stared back at him. The kid hadn't just checkmated the prosecutor. He had checkmated a billion-dollar corporation and summoned the full weight of the United States government. "They already have everything," Malik concluded, stepping back. "The FBI is likely securing warrants for NexusTech's headquarters, Mr. Hale's office, and Officer Keller's precinct right now. You couldn't sweep this under the rug, even if you tried, Judge Voss." The realization washed over the courtroom. The game was over. The trap had closed. Voss took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked down at the teenager who had systematically dismantled the corrupt machinery of his courtroom in less than an hour. For the first time in his life, the ruthless judge felt a profound sense of respect, entirely eclipsed by fear. Mr. Donovan, Voss said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. Regarding the charges of grand larceny and unauthorized access, the state's case is dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go. Those words hung in the stale air of courtroom 302, ringing with a finality that shattered the corrupt ecosystem Judge Harlan Voss had cultivated for years. Malik Donovan didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply reached down, picked up his faded canvas backpack, and began neatly sliding his manila folders inside. Public Defender Everett Lang was still sitting frozen in his chair, staring at the 16-year-old boy as if he had just watched a ghost rewrite the Constitution. "Malik," Lang whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you have any idea the magnitude of what you just pulled off? You didn't just beat a felony charge. You dismantled the district attorney's office." Malik zipped his backpack and slung it over one shoulder. "I didn't dismantle anything, Mr. Lang. I simply handed them the hammer and watched them smash their own fingers." Before Lang could process the sheer weight of that statement, the muffled sound of sirens bled through the thick glass windows. It wasn't the standard rising wail of a city patrol car. It was the synchronized heavy blare of multiple federal-issue SUVs converging on the courthouse. Down at the prosecution table, Quentin Hale let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. He recognized that sound. Every corrupt official did. Moments later, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom didn't just open. They were aggressively shoved apart. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark windbreakers with the unmistakable bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across the back strode down the center aisle. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. Leading the pack was Special Agent Derek Caldwell, a man with a square jaw, iron-gray hair, and absolutely zero patience for local political theater. He bypassed the gallery entirely, marching straight past the wooden partition and up to the prosecution table. "Quentin Hale?" Agent Caldwell asked, his voice flat and authoritative. Hale couldn't even stand up. His legs had completely given out. He nodded weakly, his face buried in his hands. "Quentin Hale, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of rights under color of law," Caldwell recited, producing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. 2 agents stepped forward, practically lifting the disgraced prosecutor out of his chair and securing his wrists behind his back. The satisfying click-click of the cuffs echoed perfectly in the silent room. Agent Caldwell then turned his sharp gaze to the witness stand, where Officer Vance Keller was sitting in a state of catatonic shock. "Officer Keller, save us the trouble of a chase. Stand up and put your hands behind your head." As the federal agents swarmed the corrupt officials, Caldwell approached the bench. He looked up at Judge Voss, who was practically shrinking into his high-backed leather chair, terrified that he was next. "Judge Voss," Caldwell said, slapping a thick folder onto the mahogany wood, "I have a federal subpoena for the immediate seizure of all transcripts, audio recordings, and evidentiary exhibits related to the preliminary hearing of one Malik Donovan. We are specifically looking for a USB drive and a physical copy of a dispatch communication log." Voss's hands shook violently as he pushed the small silver drive across the desk. "It's all here, Agent Caldwell. Well, every word is on the record. I assure you, this court had no prior knowledge of Mr. Hale's illicit activities. We'll let the grand jury decide that, Your Honor," Caldwell replied coldly, sliding the drive into an evidence bag. While the courthouse was descending into federal chaos, a perfectly synchronized raid was occurring miles away in the opulent glass and steel skyscraper of NexusTech. CEO Marcus Langford was sitting in his top-floor boardroom, aggressively finalizing the paperwork for their multi-million-dollar IPO with a team of lead underwriters from a major investment bank. He had just uncorked a bottle of vintage champagne when the frosted glass doors of the boardroom were shattered by the butt of a tactical rifle. Agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by the FBI's Cyber Division, flooded the room. Analysts from a real-world elite cybersecurity firm contracted by the government were immediately brought in to secure NexusTech's physical servers before Langford could trigger a data wipe. "Marcus Langford," a federal agent shouted over the screaming executives. "Step away from the laptop. You are under arrest for massive securities fraud, violating the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and criminal negligence regarding a catastrophic consumer data breach." The champagne flute slipped from Langford's hand, shattering against the imported marble floor. In an instant, his billionaire dreams evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a federal penitentiary. The stock underwriters immediately began frantically dialing their legal departments, sprinting out of the room to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. NexusTech's valuation plummeted to zero in a matter of seconds. Back in Courtroom 302, Malik Donovan stood near the swinging wooden gate, watching the FBI cart Quentin Hale out in handcuffs. The prosecutor looked back, his eyes hollow, silently realizing that a kid from the neighborhood he had systematically oppressed was the architect of his total destruction. Malik met his gaze, offering a slow, deliberate nod. It was the ultimate delivery of hard, undeniable karma. Agent Caldwell paused as he walked past Malik. The seasoned FBI veteran looked down at the teenager in the oversized faded suit. Caldwell had read the encrypted dead man's switch packet. He knew exactly whose genius had unraveled a multi-million-dollar conspiracy before breakfast. "You took a massive risk today, kid," Caldwell said quietly, his tone laced with profound respect. "If your trap hadn't worked, they would have buried you in a juvenile cell until you were 30. "I don't rely on luck, Agent Caldwell," Malik replied calmly, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "I rely on the law and the arrogant assumption that men in power never look down to see who is pulling the rug out from under them." Caldwell cracked a rare smile. "If you ever get tired of defending yourself, give the Bureau a call in a few years. We could use a mind like yours." Malik simply smiled politely, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked out into the echoing hallway of the courthouse. The storm outside had finally broken, and rays of morning sunlight were beginning to pierce through the high rotunda windows, casting a warm golden glow across the marble floors. He had walked into the building as a victim of a corrupt system. He was walking out as its master. The legend of Courtroom 302 did not stay confined to the mahogany-paneled walls of the Fulton County Courthouse. By that same day, the story had leaked to the local press, and by evening broadcast, it was the leading headline across every major national news network. The narrative of a 16-year-old prodigy single-handedly dismantling a corrupt political and corporate syndicate was too poetic, too undeniably satisfying to ignore. The karma that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. District Attorney Quentin Hale, the man who had built his career on intimidating the defenseless and burying exculpatory evidence, found himself entirely devoid of allies. The local police union, desperate to salvage its own shattered public image, immediately disavowed him. During his federal trial, Hale attempted to negotiate a plea deal, weeping openly in front of a federal magistrate. His tears earned him no sympathy. He was sentenced to 84 months at a medium-security federal correctional institution in southern Georgia. The man who had sent hundreds of young men to prison was now forced to wear the very same standard-issue khaki uniform he had mocked for years. Officer Vance Keller didn't fare much better. The federal prosecutors used his own suppressed dispatch audio against him in a devastating 2-day trial. Stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom, Keller received a 5-year sentence for perjury, evidence tampering, and violation of civil rights under color of law. But the most spectacular downfall belonged to Marcus Langford, the billionaire CEO of NexusTech. The raid by the SEC and the FBI's cyber division uncovered a rot so deep it threatened to destabilize the regional tech market. Langford had not only ignored the massive data breach of 40,000 citizens, but forensic accountants discovered he had been utilizing offshore accounts to artificially inflate NexusTech's valuation ahead of their initial public offering. The Department of Justice seized his assets, froze his bank accounts, and dismantled his empire piece by piece. Langford was convicted of massive securities fraud and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. NexusTech was completely liquidated, its remaining assets sold off to compensate the victims of the data breach that Malik had tried to warn them about. As for Judge Harlan Voss, the architect of the arrogant truth or lie game, he managed to avoid a federal indictment by a razor-thin margin, arguing ignorance of the district attorney's specific actions. However, the State Judicial Review Board was not nearly as forgiving. The official transcript from Mrs. Whitaker, which Voss was completely powerless to suppress, became the central piece of evidence in his disciplinary hearing. Faced with inevitable impeachment and the stripping of his law license, Voss was forced into an early, highly disgraced retirement. He spent the rest of his days isolated in his sprawling suburban home, forever known in the legal community as the veteran judge who was completely outwitted and humiliated by a teenager in a cheap suit. The entire ecosystem of corruption was burned to the ground, leaving behind a sterilized environment where the law was, for the first time in a decade, forced to operate with transparency. And then there was Malik Donovan. Walking out of the courthouse that rainy morning was just the beginning. The national spotlight turned him into a symbol of fierce, unapologetic intellect. He didn't return to the shadows. Instead, he leaned into the brilliance that had saved his life. Within weeks of the incident, Malik was approached by recruiters from some of the most prestigious academic institutions in the country. 2 years later, Malik graduated high school as valedictorian and accepted a full-ride merit scholarship to Yale University, double majoring in computer science and pre-law. He no longer needed to salvage broken server parts from wet dumpsters. The university granted him unfettered access to their state-of-the-art quantum computing labs. He eventually attended Harvard Law School, where his professors frequently cited the now famous transcript of his pro-SE defense as a masterclass in exploiting procedural overreach and maintaining composure under extreme duress. Upon passing the bar exam with one of the highest scores in the state's history, Malik didn't sell out to the massive corporate law firms that desperately tried to recruit him with multi-million-dollar signing bonuses. Instead, Malik Donovan returned to Atlanta. He opened his own boutique defense firm just 3 blocks away from the Fulton County Courthouse. He specialized in cases involving digital privacy, corporate overreach, and the defense of juveniles who had been discarded by the system. He became a nightmare for any prosecutor who thought they could cut corners, hide evidence, or play games with the lives of the innocent. Every time Malik walked into a courtroom wearing an impeccably tailored suit that actually fit, the atmosphere shifted. Judges sat a little straighter. Prosecutors double-checked their discovery files because everyone in the building knew exactly who he was. They knew the legend. They knew that if you ever tried to play a game of truth or lie with Malik Donovan, the truth would absolutely destroy you. And there you have it, the incredible true-to-life story of how one brilliant teenager outsmarted an entire system of corruption. Malik's story is the ultimate proof that intelligence and courage can break the most powerful chains of injustice. When they tried to play games with his life, he rewrote the rules and delivered the hardest dose of karma imaginable. If you felt your heart pounding during that legendary courtroom showdown, do me a massive favor and absolutely smash that like button right now. Share this video with your friends and family. Everyone needs to hear this inspiring underdog victory. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you'll never miss out on our jaw-dropping dramatic stories. What would you have done in Malik's shoes? Drop a comment below, and let's discuss. Until next time, stay sharp and always stand your ground.